Taub Hospital in Houston is known for what most emergency departments can barely handle: endless trauma cases, overcrowding, and a constant flow of walk-ins arriving in the worst moments of their lives. Nurses and doctors here work through chaos as if it is routine. But among all the noise, alarms, and rushing staff, there is one story whispered by ER workers who swear it truly happened, something that still makes new hires uneasy whenever they take the night shift. The story of the whispering patient. It began on a stormy night in the mid-2000s when a disoriented middle-aged man wandered into the ER waiting room. No ID, no family, soaked from rain, shivering, and mumbling rapidly under his breath. Security first assumed he was experiencing a psychiatric crisis, something the hospital saw often. But nurses noticed something strange. He wasn't talking to himself. He was whispering directly at people nearby, saying things he should not have been able to know. Personal details. Secrets. Fears they never spoke aloud. When staff tried to get his name, he repeated fragments of sentences like he was answering someone no one else could see. They moved him to an exam room, but the whispering didn't stop. Doctors attempted to evaluate him, but every time someone stepped inside, the patient would fix his eyes on them and speak in a low, rattling whisper that made their skin crawl. A young resident froze when the man whispered the exact words her father said to her before he passed away, something she had never told anyone. Another nurse said he whispered her childhood nickname, one only her mother used. Staff wanted to believe it was coincidence, some kind of psychological mirroring, but the man's expression never changed. His voice never rose. His eyes never blinked enough for someone conscious and alert. It looked as though he was listening to something else, something far away, and simply repeating it. The storm outside got worse as the patient's condition declined. His vitals were unstable, his breathing shallow, but every time they attempted treatment, the whispering intensified. One nurse fled the room in tears after the man quietly recited details of a traumatic event she had never shared. To her, it felt impossible for him to know. To others, it felt like a cruel coincidence amplified by the stress of the job. But the longer he stayed, the more impossible things became. Around 3 a.m., power flickered across the hospital. Backup systems kicked in. But in those few seconds of darkness, multiple staff members swear they heard whispering in the entire hallway, not through speakers, but right next to their ears, as if someone leaned close in the dark. When the lights returned, the whispering stopped everywhere except the patient's room. His whisper was constant, almost mechanical. Doctors made the decision to sedate him for safety, but before the medication took effect, he whispered one last sentence that frightened everyone who heard him. "Not yet. They're not done speaking." Then he went completely silent for the first time since he arrived. But the room suddenly felt colder, like a draft had passed through even though the door was closed. Moments later, the man's heart rate dropped rapidly. They attempted to stabilize him, but the patient coded without warning. The crash team rushed in, but every attempt to revive him failed. He was pronounced dead at 3:27 a.m. As soon as he flatlined, staff members near the doorway reported a sudden pressure in their ears, like someone sighing directly beside them. The body was taken to the hospital morgue, and the room he occupied was prepped for cleaning. But when environmental services entered, they walked straight back out and refused to return. They claimed they heard whispering inside the empty room, soft and continuous, even though no one else was there. Multiple workers confirmed the same thing throughout the week. Anyone who stood in that room long enough heard faint, low whispers coming from the same corner where the patient had died. Hospital administration dismissed it as stress, electrical interference, or exaggerated rumors. But the night shift staff still talks about what happened in the days after the patient's death. Some say the whispers didn't stop when the man died, they changed. They sounded distant, muffled, like they came from behind the walls, and only happened at night. Nurses began requesting not to be assigned to that part of the ER during overnight shifts. More than one patient reported hearing a man whispering near their bed even when no staff were present. The strangest moment came when security reviewed footage from that hallway. In one recording taken at 3:27 a.m., the exact time the patient died, the camera glitched for 5 seconds. When the footage stabilized, a dark figure could be seen standing just outside the patient's room, unmoving, silhouetted by the emergency lights. The figure vanished when the camera blinked again moments later. Staff insisted it was a distortion. Others were not so sure. After the patient's death, people hoped the strange events would fade. But at Taub, whispers linger longer than memories. For weeks after the incident, the ER night shift staff felt as if the atmosphere itself had changed, heavier, colder, like the air carried a charge. Some assumed it was just the stress of working nights in one of the busiest trauma centers in Texas. But then the reports began again, and this time from people who had never even heard the whispering patient story. It started with an EMT who brought in a patient just before midnight. As he rolled the stretcher down the hallway, he heard a voice behind him whisper, "Stop." He turned around. No one was there. He shrugged it off as exhaustion. But then it whispered again, this time right beside his ear. He dropped the chart he was holding and sprinted straight out of the ER bay, refusing to come back inside until another medic walked with him. Later, he asked his partner if he'd heard anything. The partner shook his head and said, "No, but you look like you saw a ghost." During the next week, 2 patients in different rooms complained that someone kept whispering their names during the night. One patient became so distressed he demanded to be discharged early. Another patient insisted a man stood in the corner of her room whispering every time she closed her eyes. Nurses checked the room multiple times. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No shadow. No movement except the monitors blinking on and off, as if reacting to something unseen. One nurse, who had been working at Taub for over 15 years, said she finally understood why the staff refused to talk about the incident in detail. Late one night while she was charting, she heard whispering coming from the old exam room where the patient had died. She assumed someone was inside, but when she opened the door, the lights flickered, and the room was empty. The whispering stopped instantly, but as soon as she stepped back into the hallway, it started again behind her, quiet enough to be unmistakable, loud enough to make her break into a run. Security attempted to investigate, but cameras in that hallway began malfunctioning repeatedly. Footage would freeze for several seconds, then resume with the image slightly distorted. One clip showed a dark shape crossing behind a nurse, even though she was alone. Another recording caught a whispering sound on its audio feed, so faint you could barely distinguish the words, but clear enough to raise alarm. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't static. It sounded human. Some staff members believed the whispering patient had not been whispering to them at all. They thought he had been repeating what he heard, something that was not human, something that did not leave when his heart stopped. And if that was true, then whatever spoke to him was still inside the ER, still roaming the halls, still whispering to anyone unlucky enough to pass by alone. As weeks turned into months, the staff adapted in the way healthcare workers always do. They avoided certain rooms. They kept lights brighter at night. They moved in pairs, even when they didn't say why. But new employees noticed the tension. They noticed how senior nurses refused to assign new patients to that one exam room after 2 a.m. They noticed how security guards leaned a little forward in their chairs whenever the hallway monitors flickered. And they noticed that no one, not even the bravest, walked into that part of the ER without glancing over their shoulder first. One night, a traveling nurse unfamiliar with the hospital's unspoken rules was asked to deliver lab samples through that hallway. She joked that everyone acted like the place was haunted. The staff didn't laugh. She returned 10 minutes later pale, shaking, and struggling to breathe. She said someone whispered her full name directly behind her, even though she hadn't passed a single person. She said she felt breath on the back of her neck. She refused to ever walk that hallway again. Rumors spread fast. Some believed a spirit was trapped there. Others thought the patient had opened some kind of door, repeating words not meant for the living. A few claimed the voices were warning signs, that whatever whispered knew things it should not know. But no one had a real answer. No one knew what the whispering wanted. Then came the night when everything escalated. A trauma patient was being rushed into surgery when alarms across the ER malfunctioned all at once. Every monitor started blinking. Every speaker emitted a single sharp crack. In the chaos, multiple staff members heard whispering in the hall, hundreds of tiny overlapping whispers, like a crowd speaking at once. Some covered their ears. Some froze. The trauma team didn't stop working, but several nurses reported seeing a shadow move against the wall in the same hallway where the patient had died. When the equipment stabilized, the whispers faded instantly. But something had changed. The ER felt colder. The lights dimmed more often. And anyone who worked there long enough noticed that the moment between 3:26 and 3:27 a.m., the minute the whispering patient had died, always felt wrong, like the air thickened and the building itself held its breath. No one talks about the whispering patient publicly. No official report exists. But every night shift nurse at Taub will quietly warn new hires the same thing. If you hear someone whisper your name, don't look back. Because the dead don't whisper by accident. And whatever whispers in that hallway is still searching for someone who will finally listen.